Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today for this webinar. I'm grateful to Kevin Kavanaugh for hosting it on this topic that is a little different from a lot of the other patient safety and quality work that's out there. And like the previous books I've done on medical errors and overtreatment, this one was a journey, and you start out looking for a good story, and I think we've come up with one that really is a very, very compelling expose of the dramatic shift in where our prescription drugs are being made. I'm just going to go through a series of slides, and they're very high level. I won't get into as much detail at all as what's in the book, and I'm hoping we can have a lot of good questions and dialogue afterward. So I'll keep this pretty short because I want to hear from you and your questions, your thoughts, your reactions. So we'll get started. The book is called China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. I spent about 3+ years doing research for this book because this is a very hidden story. It took a lot of in-depth research and talking with people in the field and in government and industry to find out what the real story is. So many Americans, probably almost all of us at some point in our lives, take a prescription drug. Many of us also get them in these amber-colored plastic bottles with the white caps that are hard to open. But we rarely see what the country of origin is. We usually see our names, the doctor who prescribed it, the name of the medicine, how to take it, whether with food or not, the dose, and so forth. But we really don't see where they're coming from. So it turns out there's been a huge shift in where America's drugs are being made. Back in the 1980s, and this is a little schematic to show general trends, back then the U.S., Europe, and Japan made what I'm calling the active pharmaceutical ingredients. These are the ingredients in our antibiotics or chemotherapies or antidepressants that provide the therapeutic value. So these are really, really important components. And the West and Japan used to make them. But let's fast forward a couple of decades, and China is the dominant supplier of active pharmaceutical ingredients for Europe, the U.S., and even India, which, as many of you know, is a big generic drug maker. So this is a sea change. It's been happening very quietly, but it's having really profound impact. So what does it mean for you and for me? So it means that millions of Americans are taking medicines made in China by Chinese companies, and we don't know it, and neither do their doctors. And so, but for now, China's biggest footprint is making the active ingredients for thousands of medicines. Think about vitamin C and ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid is the active ingredient. So we've got two things going on here. China is ramping up production of generic drugs really fast. That's its new line of action, but for right now, its biggest footprint is making the key ingredients. And when you control that, you really control the global drug supply. So how dependent are we? I had the pleasure of interviewing some wonderful people in the industry. It's interesting that those in Europe were, frankly, more forthcoming and transparent than were folks in the industry here in the United States. This is a quote from the CEO of a European manufacturer who said, if China for some reason decided to stop exporting active pharmaceutical ingredients, within 3 months all our pharmacies would be empty. That's a pretty startling statement. Again, this has all happened very quietly, under the radar, unbeknownst to us as consumers, to doctors, to pharmacists, and to many in the public policy community. As part of doing the research and digging for this book, the pharmaceutical industry trade press had a lot of very helpful information about these trends. This was a pretty startling but accurate headline. Fierce Pharma is one of these industry newsletters. It's very helpful in explaining what's going on. But look at the title. This is from 2012. Dangers aside, drug makers can't live without Chinese active ingredients. Again, the piece of our medicines that give it their therapeutic value. As I've talked about this topic, one of the things that people remind me of is, well, don't we get a lot of our generics from India? And that's right. But it turns out India is dependent on China, too, for these key ingredients to make the many, many generic drugs that it manufactures and sends around the world. The other thing that's interesting, though, unlike the United States, it's much more open about this fact to the public, and you see stories in the media, whereas we don't see too much of it here in the U.S. in the mainstream media. This was an article in the Economic Times, a newspaper in India. India heavily relying on China for 12 essential medicines. And another one from the BBC, India too reliant. And it worries the leadership in that government because it has national security implications. Here's what the BBC wrote in its article. India produces a third of the world's medicines, mostly in the form of generics, but China has a virtual monopoly over pricing and supply of active ingredients. There are no domestic producers left for many essential medicines in India. The government is now worried that in the event of a dispute with China, India could face a public health crisis. So as I read about this, I thought about, what about here in the U.S.? Do we have a similar thing happening? There's tensions in the South China Sea, and if there are disputes, will the trade routes be blocked? Will we be able to access our medicines? What if there's a public health crisis, say a global pandemic that affects the United States? Or what if there's a Fukushima-type event in China and it affects a lot of manufacturing plants? The United States and the rest of the world will have to line up behind other countries. So what are the risks? So if China shut the door on exports to the U.S., basically hospitals would cease to function. Now people say with all the talk about trade and tariffs right now, are we at risk for that? And my response to that is it's pretty unlikely that that will happen now. China has leverage, but I don't think it'll use it now. And the reason is China's aim, stated very clearly and powerfully, is to become the pharmacy to the world. It wants to do that as part of this plan that it has for its industrial policy. So for right now, it would be a pretty big public relations disaster if it tried to interfere with access to medicines for the United States. But down the road, as we become more and more dependent on China, which is what's happening, it will have more and more leverage. So we have to be really aware of it. So how did this happen? How did we get to making medicines and their key ingredients here in the U.S. and Europe and Japan and moving it over to China? Well, it turns out there's a couple of factors. Some of you might remember the generic drug law, the Hatch-Waxman Act, that was passed in 1984. And that was an incredibly valuable piece of legislation that made so many medicines affordable for millions and millions of Americans since then. You can only imagine how many billions consumers have saved. But if we're going to have cheaper drugs, that led to a search for manufacturers that can make them more cheaply. But what was the result of that? At that time, the FDA was unprepared for medicine making in other countries. It had been used to inspecting plants in the U.S., but it really didn't have the resources or expertise to inspect plants in other countries. So here's what happened 12 years after the generic drug law was enacted. I dug up this 1996 internal FDA memo written by a very dedicated public servant in the agency. He's a chemist by training, as I recall. He was very honest. He was alerting the leadership, saying, quote, "We literally have no control over the bulk drugs, these key ingredients that enter the U.S., and these drugs can reach anyone, including the president." Now, there's another huge factor in what's prompted so many of our medicines being made in China. And it's our trade policy. I mean, who knew? Who would ever think that trade policy would have an impact on our medicines? But it's been huge. And that started in 2000 when President Clinton and Congress passed legislation that made it easier for China to sell all kinds of products to the U.S. And there was a law passed that normalized trade relations with China and basically removed tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. from there, sort of freeing up the marketplace. But as I was working on this book, it was amazing to look at a pattern. It took a lot of digging for each of these topics to understand what was happening and the impact on trade. Within 4 years of opening trade with China, the last penicillin, many of us have taken penicillin unless we're allergic to it. We used to make it here in the U.S. You might remember in World War II, companies and industry got together to make sure there was enough to go around after the invasion of Normandy to make sure that soldiers would survive from infections, from their wounds. Like, who knows how many did. It was an incredible moment in medical history. But it turns out in 2004, the last penicillin fermentation plant in the U.S. closed, and European and Indian producers were driven out of business. And I'll describe why that happened. Another thing that happened within 4 years is that vitamin C, huge vitamin C cartel in China formed and drove up prices. First of all, they drove out U.S. manufacturers, European manufacturers, dumped it on the U.S. market at really below price. Nobody else could compete, so they went out of business. And then when everybody was gone from the market, prices went back up. That's what cartels do. Aspirin, the last remaining U.S. aspirin maker in the U.S., shuttered within 4 years of opening trade with China. And heparin, large healthcare company Baxter began importing heparin ingredient from China, and 3 years later, 250 plus American deaths were reported to the FDA associated with a contaminated ingredient from there. And there's so many more patterns that could come out, but these are 4 very powerful ones with common products that many Americans will know and they've used in their lives or for their families. So what happened? What caused this contaminated heparin? It turns out the U.S. company Baxter had switched to a supplier in China. They did that in 2004. And by 2007 and 2008, there were reports coming into the FDA about people being injured, people dying. It was an incredible wake-up call about how unprepared we were for all these medicines flowing into our country. And these are things that we trust. When you put a pill in your mouth, you trust that it's going to be safe. You trust all the hundreds and hundreds of people that in some way have touched that in making it in some way. And here we have this incredible breach of trust. And one of the things that I've really came to the conclusion about is that this globalization has been really a form of de facto deregulation. Back at that time with the heparin disaster and the tragedy of lost lives, there were 714 establishments in China that were making drug products for the U.S. Those are the ones the FDA knew about. Back then, the FDA didn't even know who was making medicines in China and other countries for us. And that's so different from here in the U.S. Here, it's a really pretty strict system. But over there, it was more the Wild East. But of those 714, only 88 had been inspected by the FDA during 2002 to 2007, a far lower proportion than any other country that sold drugs or ingredients to the U.S. It really was the Wild East. It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. And these are family members who lost loved ones from contaminated heparin. What was really interesting for me is to read about what I'm sure many of you remember as the number of cats and dogs that died from melamine in pet food. And that was around 2007. And it was the exact same playbook that took place with regard to heparin. A cheaper substitute was put into a product and sold as pet food, or in this case, in blood thinner. And this blood thinner is used in hospitals. It's ubiquitous. It's used in surgeries. And it's absolutely stunning that U.S.-based and European companies went to a country where this was happening and didn't think, or whatever reason, assumed that everything would be all right. And this is a picture from the New York Times that showed a Chinese factory where they're making heparin. You see the conditions there. Heparin is made from pig intestines. And this is a worker extracting the substance from those pig intestines. So this is a picture's worth 1,000 words, where globalization really is a form of deregulation. One of the stories that we tell in China RX is how we lost control over this miracle drug called penicillin. It's a fascinating story. Again, Europeans rather than American companies who were really much more transparent about what was going on. So I spoke to a gentleman, Chris Oldenhoff, who's mentioned here, from the European Trade Association of Producers of these active ingredients. Again, these key things that make medicines work. And they describe, and see the title there, a 25-year landslide in the manufacture and business of active ingredients in Europe. It really was a landslide. And here's the landslide when it comes to penicillin. Again, a medicine that I'm sure we all know people in our families or ourselves who've taken it. This is a busy graph, but you see the red or maroon color bars there. That is global penicillin production, and you see it going up from 1990s up to 2007. And then you see the other part of the bar graph in the light blue. And look what was happening. Chinese penicillin production went up dramatically, especially around 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And what this small number of companies did is they dumped it on the global market at really cheap price. This is what happens with steel right now. It's dumped on before tariffs. It's dumped on the U.S. market at really cheap prices. And other businesses can't compete. They can't sell it for that cheap price. And the Chinese companies can do it because they're subsidized by their government. So they drove out U.S. and European producers. And look what happens. Look at the yellow line. See how price went down from 1996 and all the way down to 2006, and then it went back up again. So they gained control of the market, and then they started a huge price increase after they attained global dominant market share. This is what we're seeing happen. So how could this happen? How did the U.S. allow drugs to be sold with ingredients made in China for nearly 20 years and to allow all these market games to be played without FDA oversight and inspection of the places where they were made? How did this happen? There's a great quote from a gentleman in the U.S. industry in the New York Times about a decade ago. He said, "We can blame the Chinese for this stuff as much as we want, but the truth of the matter is we're the people who are buying. And we all want cheap drugs, and companies want cheaper places to make them so they can earn a higher profit on the margin." So we do have to look in the mirror. And if we have pension funds in the stock market with drug stocks, we all want to see our stock portfolios go up if we have them. I don't, but a lot of people do. And so we want to keep seeing more and more profit because we benefit from that as shareholders. So we all have to look in the mirror. But what happened to regulatory oversight? See, the United States really did develop this gold standard. And here we moved production over to China. And look what was happening in 2007. The first leader of China's equivalent, FDA, was found guilty of taking bribes to approve untested and fake drugs. And he was executed by the Chinese government. Again, this is all the same thing that was happening around the time of the heparin incident. And here's what a spokesperson for the China FDA said with great candor. As a developing country, China's current food and drug safety situation is not very satisfactory because supervision started late. Its foundation is weak, so the supervision of food and drug safety isn't easy. This is where we were outsourcing production of so many important medicines found in our medicine cabinets, used in hospitals, operating rooms, emergency rooms. Really, really remarkable. And it happened all under the radar. And the then FDA Commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, said, "I think people have no idea in this country about the vulnerability of things that we count on every day, food, drugs, medical devices. We have a system that has big gaps in our protective mechanisms, and it's a growing problem." Just as a side point, one of the discoveries in writing this book was how we're doing the same thing with medical devices. American and European and other companies are moving production over to China, and pretty soon we'll be seeing, if we're not already, hip and knee implants coming from there, CT scanners, and so much more. And how well equipped is the FDA to really check to ensure that the products are safe? On a positive front, Congress enacted reforms in 2012, and it required all foreign generic drug makers and those who make active ingredients to register annually with the FDA and pay a fee. And FDA inspections of those facilities will be on par with those of the U.S., although everybody tells me in the industry that to go into a plant in China and do an inspection is nowhere near what it's like to do it in the U.S. Here it's the same language, similar culture, familiar culture, and inspectors are in there for a lot longer, typically. It's much more challenging to do these kinds of inspections in other countries, including China. And the reality is inspections don't guarantee quality and safety. And here's a great case in point. Bloomberg published an article in 2015 after these reforms. And at least the FDA was getting in these plants, but a Pfizer plant hid failures and used old ingredients, according to the FDA inspection report. Here's what the FDA found. Employees at the Pfizer plant concealed quality failures, used expired materials, and retested failing products until they passed. And this was particularly stunning. The FDA reported that a manufacturing unit had only one standalone toilet in disrepair 50 yards from the aseptic manufacturing unit. Inside the facility, inspectors saw no hand washing station, and an open pit appeared to be used as a urinal. This is 21st century medicine making. It's really remarkable. Safety continues to remain a challenge. The FDA does its best. I think many are committed to doing well by American consumers. They continue to find fake factories that say they're making drug products for the U.S. when in fact they're actually a front for another company. That said, China has many state-of-the-art factories, but quality is uneven. How dependent are we? Now we're coming to the point where veterans, the Veterans Health Administration, under pressure from the industry, now is permitted to buy drugs made in China. That was precluded a couple of years ago, unless they could get it nowhere else. But now, with pressure from industry, because so much is coming from there, the VA can buy drugs made in China. And the same is for the military. The Department of Defense uses drug products made in China when no other source is available. So what happens when young men and women are in the South China Sea on those vessels? Are they dependent on the adversary for their medicines? That's certainly not a situation that anyone wants to see. You know, when people ask me, give me an example of how dependent we really are, what really shocked you, what really woke you up? And as I did this research on this book over the past 3 years, every month there was a page turner, a jaw dropper, that was surprising because none of this is reported to the public. It's all hidden, and China RX exposes it. So how dependent are we? We're so dependent on China that when the FDA banned drug products from a Chinese company, the agency exempted 14 products, including key ingredients for chemotherapies used in cancer treatment, because of concerns about drug shortages. The FDA had banned 29 products and they exempted 14, again because of concerns that here in the U.S. we would have drug shortages. And the dependency is growing. It's not getting any easier. One of the real discoveries of China RX is naming, for the first time, generic drugs that are being made in China by Chinese companies and sold in the U.S. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of what we found. We have antibiotics, antidepressants, birth control pills, high blood pressure medicine, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and epilepsy medicines, chemotherapies, and HIV/AIDS medicine. As mentioned earlier, China is really ramping up production of generic drugs for sale in the United States. And I said to an executive of a U.S.-based generic drug company that China is an existential threat to your business. I think it's important for a country like the United States, an advanced developed country, to have manufacturing capability. We still manufacture a lot of medicines in this country, but we're losing it, and we're losing it quickly. Americans are losing jobs. Western drug companies have invested billions of dollars in research and development facilities in China. And here was a quote from a trade industry newsletter. It was fashionable for U.S.-based firms to announce job cuts at home and expansions in China in almost the same breath. So we're moving from one country to the other, and tens of thousands of jobs have been lost. This is a quote from a recruiter. The top companies had laid off many top-tier scientists and clinicians. They're outsourcing research to contract research organizations where salaries are much lower than in the U.S., meaning trouble for many talented, skilled people who have found it difficult to find work. These chemists are being tossed aside, often at the peak of their careers, top chemists from prestigious universities with experience at the top pharmaceutical companies. There's just no place to absorb all these scientists. And while there's a call for young people to get into STEM jobs, we're seeing an industry where there's been, during a time period in the early 2000s, 86,000 chemists who were laid off. Absolutely stunning. And here's what an industry observer said, and I think this is where we're headed. Unless very radical changes are made in how the U.S. funds, trains, and builds for pharma development and manufacturing, I can't see very much left here in 20 years. Perhaps each U.S.-based multinational will consist of a government affairs and marketing headquarters only, with everything else dispersed overseas. And as one industry insider said, I think it is a security concern, this dependence. He and I talked about the antidote for anthrax. I'm sure all of you remember when we had the anthrax attacks in Washington, D.C. and New York. And it turns out the U.S. had to get Cipro from a European manufacturer. I spoke to the CEO of that company, and he in turn said we had to get the starting material from China. And as this industry observer said, well, what if China is the anthrax attacker? It's not a good position to be in. We present a lot of recommendations in China RX about thinking of our medicines as a strategic asset, about having a forecasting and tracking system like we do for food and energy to make sure we don't run into shortages, which are pervasive now in healthcare for lots of reasons, including dependence on China. And also we need to bring some manufacturing back home. But for consumers and the public, we have an appendix in China RX on how to find out where your medicines are made. I'm going to show you this label for an Alzheimer's drug. And this is what we usually don't see when we pick up a prescription from the drugstore. You can see this is a generic for Alzheimer's, 5 milligram tablet. And you can see manufactured by a company in China and distributed by Salco Healthcare in the U.S. in Cranberry, New Jersey. Salco is the U.S. distribution arm of the Chinese company. So here's an Alzheimer's medicine made in China by a Chinese company and sold by their distributor here. And I found this from, you see in the bottom left-hand corner, the NIH, National Institute of Health, National Library of Medicine. That's one of the sources where you can find information on drug labels. The labels are on the box of your medicine, and you can see the website DailyMed at National Library of Medicine at nih.gov. Then there's another one called druginserts.com, and you have to scroll down to see the label, and you may or may not be able to find out where it was made. The other thing you can do is ask your pharmacist to show you the box if you happen to pick up your prescription in person, and take a photo of the box with your phone. And the other thing you can do is call the company and ask. And some companies were very forthcoming, and others were not. So I will stop there. I know a number of you are familiar with these other books. I'm grateful for you for joining tonight, and I hope we can have lots of great questions and some conversation.